host, Timothy Snyder. And although I think it is a particular kind of immodesty to present such a renowned scholar, I abide by the rules. So, Professor Snyder is a historian at Yale University, and he is a permanent fellow at the Institut für die Wissenschaft von Menschen. He is an author of 11 books, many of which brought him such prominent accolades as the Prize of the Foundation for the Polish Science, Hannah Arendt Prize for Political Thought, and the Leipzig Book Award for European Understanding. Professor Snyder speaks 5 languages and reads 10, including Ukrainian, which is still a rarity in academia. In fact, Ukraine occupies a particular place in his heart. For once, he called Ukraine, I quote, the most interesting European country to study. Correct me if I'm wrong. Professor Snyder might not be aware, but I and he, we have a kind of professional relationship because I translated his now classical article, The Causes of Ukrainian-Polish Ethnic Cleansing of 1933 in Russian. Anyway, it's not about me today. As a public intellectual, Professor Snyder sometimes gives 3 lectures a day. So we really appreciate the time you found in your busy schedule for the Global Minds for Ukraine. Thank you once again.
Very glad to be with you. Thank you for the invitation.
Okay, so let's start our conversation. And let me ask you the following question. Describing the road to unfreedom, you coined the notion of schizofascism. You described with this notion a regime which is unambiguously fascist, but refers to others as fascists. And you applied the notion to Russia. So the question, what about today? I mean, 2022. Is Russia still a schizofascist state, or has it evolved into something else?
Well, I would say that when I use the term schizofascism to describe Russia in Road to Unfreedom, I was applying it to particular individuals like Dugin, like Prokhanov. I was citing particular documents where people who are just unmistakably fascists are calling other people fascist who are not fascists at all. So I was trying to identify a phenomenon. I think since 2014, we've arrived at a place where schizofascism is clearly at the center of Russian policy. And the entire invasion of Ukraine is one large example of schizofascism, where we now have a regime which by almost any criterion you can think of is fascist, invading another country while claiming that it is fascist. And this is, of course, very confusing for most European and American observers. And I've been working hard to try to clear up that confusion. But yes, I think what's changed since then is that we've moved from a phenomenon to a foreign policy.
Okay, thank you. Actually, let's continue with the idea of fascism. Marlène Laruelle, a scholar from George Washington University and a renowned specialist on Russia, she once criticized you for using the epithet fascist with regard to the Russian regime. In particular, she was not really convinced that the justification, for instance, of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact or using the legacy of Ivan Ilyin, so that those were the facts which help or contribute to branding of the regime as fascist. Instead, if opted for, the fascist label should first fit Russia's political system, and second, elucidate some features of the regime. And actually, I think those are sensible suggestions. So the question, what are the indicators that Russia is a fascist state? You actually mentioned the invasion, the foreign invasion. You did this, but there should be other indicators. Napoleonic state wasn't fascist, wasn't it? So what are the indicators that Russia is a fascist state? And which elements of the Russian policy and politics would the world understand better if they accept that Russia is fascist? Because not everybody accepts it.
Yeah. No, I accept the premise of the question. I think you put it exactly the right way. I mean, because for me, fascism is not, it's not an epithet. It's not just a word to be thrown around. It's an analytical category. And so I quite agree that the right question is, do we understand more of the world if we use that category, or we understand less of the world? So going back to your previous question, I think it's very important to start out by noting that fascism is about the priority of will over reason. Fascism is a project of political imagination, and therefore it's difficult to define it in a precise way. It defies clear definition because it itself involves a rejection of both factual and logical reality. Now, if we start from there, then we might have less resistance to associating phenomena which we're used to calling postmodern with fascism. So one of my lines of analysis in Road to Unfreedom is that certain kinds of postmodern moves, like the rejection of factual reality, like the insistence on a kind of subjectivity, could be read in a fascist way. So for example, if everything is about subjectivity, then what if there's a monopoly on subjectivity? What if a leader is able to control television networks in such a way as to build a certain kind of subjectivity? Then suddenly we've looped around from what seemed like a liberating idea, namely that individual subjectivity is all that counts, to what is clearly a repressive idea, namely that one person might build a monopoly on subjectivity by saying there's no such thing as truth, and then by dominating spectacle, which is in fact a description of the Russian regime. I mean, not just mine, but plenty of other people have described it that way. So
like Peter Pomerantsev, yes.
Yeah, like Pomerantsev. So it's not a matter then of just applying the term. It's a matter of saying there might be an unexpected route towards fascism. Another unexpected route towards fascism, which is it's on my mind because of yesterday, is the whole idea of victory as the central category of politics. Now, that may not have had fascist origins, but nevertheless, the notion that politics is all about victory can be a fascist interpretation. And as the word fascism in the Soviet Union and then in Putin's Russia lost all content and became the idea of just the enemy, right? A fascist in Russian usage is not someone who has fascist views. A fascist is just the outsider. But of course, in fascism itself, politics begins from the definition of the enemy, right? That's Carl Schmitt's classic definition. And so if you just use the word fascist to mean the enemy, then you are engaged in a fascist practice, right? So if you have a day of victory in which you just use the word fascist to mean the other, that is actually a rather fascist thing to do. That may have come from a Soviet tradition, and so we may not be used to thinking of it as fascist, but in fact, it is. And then as far as the characteristics of the regime, I mean, back in 2000, back when I published Road to Unfreedom, I was insisting on fascist ideas and fascist features of the regime. I wasn't saying then that Russia is a fascist regime. I would say it now. Because in addition to a cult of the leader, we only have one party that matters. We have ritualized elections. We have the propagation of a fantasy of a golden age in the past, which can only be restored by healing violence. That's Putin's ideology of the invasion of Ukraine. We have a cult of the dead, which again, although it might have had Soviet origins, the more time passes, the more the idea of the day of victory seems to be rather a cult of the dead. We're getting ever closer to the fascist notion that the very meaning of politics is sacrifice, and that it's the job of the leader of the country or of the nation to translate death into political meaning, right? That's a fascist idea. And again, that's exactly what happens in contemporary Russia. We also have features like the total control of the media, the repetitive use of very simple forms of state propaganda, and as I think I mentioned before, the politics of us and them. Everything is about us and them. And then finally, to give one more fascist feature, Putin's idea that that globalization and the West are corrupt and have forgotten our values, whereas it's only in our country that the basic values have been preserved. That also sounds rather familiar. So honestly, I think we've reached a point where the question might be asked more usefully in the other direction, namely, let's find a feature of Russian politics which is not fascist. I think that's actually at this point a more challenging question.
Well, I concur, and also we can argue that yes, that another important feature, a classical feature of fascism, is the corporate economy. When state is actually running most of the parts of the economy, we find this as well in the in the Putin state, I meant.
Oh, I think I appreciate your saying that, because that this whole idea of corporatism is very central to fascism. And by the way, it's important that I'm just going to repeat that we're using fascism as an analytical category here, which includes various cases like Italy or like the Romanian fascists who never controlled the state. Yeah. Right. The Romanian fascists are actually, in my view, most similar to Ilyin and Putin. Like that's a tradition which I think is very close with its use of Christianity and with its appeal to orthodoxy. Right. That I think those are the people who are closest. But my point here is that this is an interpretive category, and within that interpretive category, the corporate estate is something which often gets overlooked. The idea that the state is a kind of pyramid and that everything has its place and nothing should be out of place. That is a very central idea for the Italians, for the Austrian fascists, and also for Ivan Ilyin himself, an important Russian fascist thinker. Everything has its place. There is no difference between state and civil society. You have a certain role and you fulfill that role. And ultimately, everything is along, to use the word that Russians like to use, everything is along a vertical.
Very well, thank you. You have done a great job explaining why Russia might be interpreted, and actually I think should be interpreted, I agree with you, as a fascist state. And now let's move a little bit further, because in one of your most recent articles, you advocated the neologism Russism. And although you raised a number of convincing arguments for introducing the notion, there is something which makes me unsure whether we really should do it. Let me elaborate. So here is like a comment to the answer, a question. I think it is counterproductive to substitute the generic term fascism with national variations. Because, you know, scholars, they refer sometimes to Ustashism, to Rexism, it's like a Belgian fascism, to integralism, French fascism, to metaxism, Greek fascism. And they always point to differences between these national variations and fascism as an ideal type. And there is even a scholarly tradition which argues that German National Socialism was not fascism at all. And this constitutes a problem. Neologisms, they open the door for allegations, something like Rexism and metaxism, or Russism for the matter. They are phenomena which are different from pure fascism. And this is a step to exculpate fascists from their epoch, to show them as not so really fascist. So here is the question. Could the benefits of using the notion of Russism overweight the drawbacks? Or maybe I'm just, over dramatizing if there are no drawbacks at all.
Well, I think, Ivan, I think you're several steps away from all I was trying to do in my little Russism article. So in my Russism article, which I'm very happy exists. I mean, we're now in a world where the New York Times Magazine let me write 5,000 words about a single Ukrainian word, there's something marvelous about that, because it wasn't so long ago that Ukrainian culture just really didn't figure in the American mainstream at all. And suddenly I'm allowed to write 5,000 words about this this sort of minor Ukrainian linguistic phenomenon. What I was saying about Russism, just for everyone who I'm sure hasn't read this article, is that it's an example of Ukrainian linguistic creativity. And so I spent a lot of time in this article explaining that there's a Ukrainian neologism, Rasha or Rashka, and explaining how Russism is a kind of conglomerate of Rasha plus fascism, right? And explaining how this is an example of a larger practice of Ukrainian play with language, not just Russian, but now English as well. And then what I was trying to do is to introduce a feature of Ukrainian culture, which is this kind of creativity. Because in the English language discussion about Ukraine, there's always this sense of, well, are they really Russians because they speak Russian, or maybe they're Ukrainian nationalists because they speak Ukrainian, and somehow that doesn't leave room for the actual civic Ukrainian nation with its actual linguistic practices. So I was trying to give an example of how speaking two languages and even mixing them up can be a culturally creative act. That's what I was doing with Rashism. Like which in English I transliterated or transcribed rather as Rushism. So is this a useful category or not? I mean, it's in massive Ukrainian use, right? So you can't get through the comment section, of any Ukrainian, article without getting, and it's also in use by the Ukrainian state. I mean, the Ukrainian state is using, Rashism constantly. So just as a kind of brute empirical fact, it's out there in the world. The second point I would make is that unlike some of the other examples you get, Rashism or even Rushism is clearly a kind of fascism. I mean, because of the way that it's spelled and because of the way that it sounds. So I guess I'd be less concerned about it being treated as not fascism. And then if I would, I guess my counter argument would be something like this. People have a hard time, in my experience, imagining that there can be such a thing as Russian fascism, precisely because on the surface, there's all this anti-fascist rhetoric and because of the Soviet legacy of anti-fascism, which of course wasn't always so clear-cut. And so I actually tend to think that a word which actually puts Russia and fascism together might be useful, because not just in America, but in Germany especially, there's a lot of difficulty actually imagining that Russia can be fascist, even when, as we were talking about before, the signs of it are pretty strong. So I'm less worried about that. I mean, maybe you'll turn out to be right. We'll see, but I'm less worried about that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Once again, it's only like a kind of a concern, because I've seen too often those national variations with fascism, which actually diluted the common roots of the national phenomenon with fascism. But anyway, once again, when I read the article, because I was a little bit skeptical, but when I read it, and I read it from the beginning to the very end, I said, well, that's a good point, actually. It is a one to discuss about, but it's a good point. So once again, thank you for those 5,000 words on the Ukrainian neologism. Now, let's add some history to our discussion, since you are a historian who writes many books about history. So people often use the notion of Ostpolitik to describe the policy of Willy Brandt. However, there is a more ominous meaning. In 1919, the German Minister of Economic Affairs, Robert Schmidt, he suggested that Germany should restore economic ties with Russia as a means to get Germany out of a dire post-war economic circumstances. Once again, it is 1919. And he had some reasons to advocate for this policy, because Germany had been Russia's top trading partner in 1912 and 1913. And Russia had simultaneously been the second largest importer of German goods prior to the First World War. So Schmidt and his other colleagues at the German Foreign Ministry, they constituted a group that would become known as the Ostpolitik faction. And they sought to normalize relations with Russia and push for economic collaboration. This Ostpolitik group, they envisaged that Germany, as a producer of high-tech industrial products, and Russia, with its countless raw materials, they were natural allies. And just reminding our public, not the professor of history, Weimar Republic, Weimar Germany, had just crushed a Spartakist rebellion, like a far-left rebellion. Russia was a Bolshevik state, which was still eager to provoke a revolution in Germany. But despite those ideological differences, they collaborated, and we had the Locarno Treaty, we had subsequent German-Soviet cooperation in many areas. So the net outcome of this cooperation were the Bloodlands and the destruction of East and Central Europe by Germany and Russia. Finally, the question, should we Ukrainians be concerned? Is there a geopolitical and maybe a materialistic reason for Germans' unwillingness to acknowledge its historical responsibility towards Ukraine?
Well, yeah, yes, of course. I mean, so let me make a couple of points there. Number one, Ostpolitik can mean various things, but Ostpolitik in the last 40 years or so has generally meant going to Moscow, either to Brezhnev's Moscow or to Yeltsin's Moscow or Putin's Moscow. And in the German mind, Ostpolitik is connected to Vergangenheitsbewältigung or Erinnerungspolitik. It's connected to the project of getting over the past. And what's been dangerous here for Ukrainians has been the problem of Germans trying to come to terms with the past by talking to another imperial power. Because the overlap between German colonial practice and Russian colonial practice is ignoring Ukraine or treating Ukraine as a kind of object. I'm not trying to say that it's exactly the same, but there has been a kind of comfortable overlap. So naturally, neither Brezhnev nor Putin is going to remind, Brandt or Gerhard Schröder that Ukraine is a country and we should take it seriously. That's if Ostpolitik means going to Moscow, that's never going to happen. So what I've been trying to explain to Germans, and of course many Germans understand this now themselves, is that an actual politics of memory or an attempt to come to terms with history has to begin with your own colonial practices. It has to begin with your own history as opposed to what happens to be convenient in foreign policy. And those two things are not always going to be the same. So Germans have to remember that the Second World War was actually a colonial war and that Ukraine was the main object of the Ukrainian war. And therefore, Germans have to remember that if they're not used to talking about Ukrainians, or if they find it easy to criticize Ukrainians and less easy to criticize Russians, that might be a colonial inheritance which has to be worked through, which still requires a great deal of work. So, of course, you're right that the material interest can have, an ideological consequence. It might be convenient to imagine that you can go to Moscow to get forgiveness if you're also going to Moscow to get natural gas. Any Marxist would make that point. So what's demanded is for Germans to actually, realize that history and convenience are not always the same thing. And I think, what's happened, if I can put a kind of optimistic spin on a horrible situation, is that Ukrainians have forced Germans to recognize that Ukrainians are a subject in history and not just an object in history. And now what we've seen in the last few weeks is that Germans are having a discussion which really should have happened in the last few decades, right? There should have always been, at the very latest from 1991, there should have always been a German turn which said part of our policy of remembrance has to be about Ukraine because Ukraine was at the center of our colonial war. That hasn't happened. And so what we see then is all this German confusion of the last few weeks as this process, which should have happened over decades, is now being compressed into a matter of days.
Thank you. Thank you. Once again, there is a well-known German notion of Mitteleuropa, which actually describes the Bloodlands to be conquered and to be governed, but not to be let alone. So there is that problem. Well, now making the discussion a little bit more personal, and staying in the Bloodlands still, I will quote one of your fellow historians, Richard Evans, who, while reviewing your book, The Bloodlands, he criticized your position on Endlösung. In a nutshell, he built a functionalist argument. He tried to explain in an article that the decision to exterminate Jews was produced not by a maniacal anti-Semitism of the Führer, but by what Martin Brossard once dubbed the institutional jungles of the Third Reich. So that discussion of the intentionalist and functionalist, it made sense in 1980s to actually understand the Shoah, the Endlösung. But I want actually to temporalize the question. So what about atrocities committed by Russians in 2022? Would you espouse a functionalist or an intentionalist approach? So why did they commit Bucha?
So there's an awful lot going on in your question, and I have to slow down and maybe explain some of the premises of your question. So first of all, I mean, as a basic methodological point, the problem with a lot of German discussion of the Holocaust was that its use of only German language sources. And so if you only use German language sources, naturally you're going to be trapped into the kinds of options which you've just described. You know, is there an intention from Germany, or is there a bureaucratic dynamic inside Germany? The reason why I rejected both of those approaches is that I didn't think the Holocaust was possible to understand without seeing what happened when German force got beyond Germany. And so what was different, I mean, I'm not saying that I'm right about everything, but what was different about my own methodology is that unlike Professor Evans and unlike the German historians in the Historikerstreit, I was also using Yiddish sources and Polish sources and Russian sources and Ukrainian sources and so on. And those sources give you a different picture of what's happening in Eastern Europe. Those sources allow you, for example, to see how important it was that the Soviet Union had destroyed state institutions before the Germans arrived. It allows you to see all kinds of micro-political phenomena, which then affect how the Germans take their own decisions. So, I mean, my argument in Bloodlands and then in Black Earth about the Holocaust is that you have to follow the Germans into the territories where they actually commit the crimes. And you have to understand certain things about those territories that the Germans themselves did not necessarily understand before you can explain what's going on. So my approach was actually very conservative. I mean, it's a very normal conservative historical approach to say you have to collect all the sources and understand things that actors didn't understand. Whereas what Professor Evans is defending is a kind of standard conservative view, which says, let's look at everything from the point of view of the imperial power and only use their sources, right? Which I think turned out to be insufficient, to put it politely, with respect to the Holocaust. So my own argument is neither intentionalist nor functionalist. What it says is that the intentions of Hitler are very important, but they only matter once German power, or they chiefly matter once German power gets beyond Germany, and when German institutions are destroying other pre-existing institutions. The dynamics of German bureaucracy are also very important, but what matters more is the destruction of other bureaucracies which had already existed and which allowed people to be, even Jews, to be citizens of other flawed regimes. So I don't want to go into all the details, but I would just say that my argument is much more has to do with a colonial scale and the war as it was actually fought than it does with narrow German interpretations. So with Bucha and with the Russian war of destruction in Ukraine, I would say that Putin's ideas are very important, but like Hitler's ideas, they have to do with they begin from the assumption that a country is only realized outside its own borders. So again, I'm not saying the ideas are exactly the same, but they have this common feature. Hitler's idea was that the German race had a mission which could only be fulfilled beyond Germany. Putin has been saying that Russia only exists insofar as it absorbs Ukraine. Russia only becomes itself when it absorbs Ukraine. So that's an intention, but how that intention becomes a policy of mass murder can only be understood when that intention meets reality, right? So in the German case, Hitler has an intention that the Jews be removed from the world. How is that carried out in reality? Well, when his intention meets a kind of resistance in the form of the Red Army, also in the form of the Americans and the British coming into the war, the intention then becomes reality, not in the way he expected, but in the killing of Jews where they lived. Again, not everything is the same, but if we look at Russia's policy towards Ukraine, Putin's intention involved Ukrainians surrendering, the Ukrainian political elite being murdered, and the rest of the Ukrainians turning out to be a kind of undefined mass, which would go along with Russia. When that turned out not to be true, then there has to be an escalation. If there are more people who identify with Ukraine, that means more people have to be deported and more people have to be murdered. So you can only understand the intention when you get into contact with the other country, right? So in that sense, like my analysis would be again a kind of colonial analysis where you have ideas about the country to be subjugated, but those ideas only become policy in a kind of interaction with what actually happens in the country itself.
Thank you very much. Once again, I have to apologize if my question was too dense, too packed, but I actually think that you made a great job answering it, showing actually that functional approach to the issue and that idea of Lebensraum, or I don't know, жизненное пространство, which Russians are using and which actually made them more murderous than maybe they didn't intend to be. So once again, I apologize if the question was too packed. Let's continue. Let's continue with the similar problems, and actually with Evans. Guido Francizetti once noticed that this public disagreement of yours with Richard Evans is also a matter of generational difference between a historian who belongs to the British New Left, I mean Evans, and a historian who grew up under the shadow of the Historikerstreit, you referred to it, and you yourself, you called yourself the last Cold War generation member. So the question, could a generational difference explain why some historians and public intellectuals espouse a relatively pro-Russian view? And since I really want you to be a little more precise, here is some context. In a recent article, Shayla Fitzpatrick claims that there has been a civil war in Ukraine since 2014. She explains that Ukraine must not join NATO because, I quote, Ukraine was a foundational member of the Soviet Union since the early 1920s. And Ukraine has close ties to the Russians in language and culture. So we have a very particular pro-Russian position of Fitzpatrick. And there is a professional political philosopher, Noam Chomsky, who has recently suggested that President Zelensky should pay attention to the reality of the world, that was a quote, which effectively meant, another quote, accepting federalization of Ukraine and renunciation of Crimea. So my question, once again, wrapping it up, why did Fitzpatrick and Chomsky take such an apologetic approach to invasion? And going from personalities to public opinion, why some leftists, despite their avowed anti-imperialism, tend to align with Russia? Isn't it paradoxical that they support a traditionalist, chauvinistic, chronic capitalist Putin's regime? So is it about generations? Is it about ideology? What is happening?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm going to answer this question in terms of phenomena rather than personalities, because it seems like, the question to Professor Fitzpatrick is a question to her. And the question to Professor Evans is a question to him. To Professor Chomsky, it's a question to him. But I'd be more comfortable with phenomena. And one of the phenomena is very simple. Have these people been to Ukraine or not?
Have they? I don't know. Have they?
No, it's a rhetorical question. They have not. So, or rarely, right? Or not recently. I mean, when I think of Maidan, which was, in which there was a similar controversy, in which was actually much worse, in which Russian propaganda functioned much better than it does now. One of my first question was, have you actually been to Ukraine? And that really decided a lot. I mean, it decided more, I think, than generation or even politics. People who had been to Ukraine generally would see Ukrainians as actors and would be less likely to think, I have to accept, some Russian view of what's going on. And the reason why experience is so important, I think, is that the Ukrainian nationhood or subjectivity is much more about action than it is about declaration. And it's much more about the future than it is about myths about the past. And so myths about the past and ideology are pretty easy for intellectuals to process, right? Whereas experience and ideas about the future tend to require more person-to-person contact. So then a second source of all this, I think, I mean, you were kind enough to mention language earlier. It has to do with language. I mean, there are people who don't, most people know neither Russian nor Ukrainian, and then most of the people who know Russian don't know Ukrainian, and that matters an awful lot too. There aren't very many of us in the West who are kind of happily functioning in Ukrainian, but that makes a huge difference as to whether you see people as subjects or not, or whether you're relying on another country, relying on Russia to interpret Ukraine for you. And that's a very central issue to me, because I guess in pronouncements like Ukraine has to do this or Ukraine has to do that, I am very uncomfortable with that. Like, I'm very uncomfortable with saying that Kenya has to do this, or that Guatemala has to do this, or Canada. I mean, I'm very uncomfortable with people in the West or in the United States saying, I'm going to tell you what reality is. Mm-hmm. And then you have to accommodate yourself to reality. I'm very uncomfortable with that, because it seems to me that that's a kind of imperialism. When you say, I can see reality, and you can't see reality because you're a small, unimportant country. So let me tell you what reality is and how you have to adjust to reality. That strikes me as a kind of imperial position, which leads me to another point you asked about the left. I think a lot of the problem here is that the American left, at least, and the German left does this too, they engage in a kind of inverted nationalism. So, if you're on the American right, you think America does everything in the world and that's great. And if you're on the American left, or at least parts of the American left, you say America does everything in the world and that's bad. I'm simplifying a little bit, but that's the basic idea. And so once you take that inverted imperialist position, it's very hard for you to see agency. So you don't see agency in Russia. You don't think the Russians had any choice. You say, well, Putin had to do it because of NATO, right? And that's comfortable because it confirms your deep down assumption that America is responsible for everything. And then if you say, well, the Ukrainians don't have any choice, they have to surrender because I said so. Again, that's comfortable. Or if you say the Ukrainians aren't, as people on the far left say, Ukrainians aren't really fighting a war, it's just a proxy war, or it's the Americans really. That's very comfortable because it confirms your own assumption that it's really America that's running the world. So there is, so part of the explanation, I think, is this inverted nationalism where many people on the left are basically kind of imperialists, but à rebours, imperialists in reverse, where they share the imperialist assumption on the right that one country is really responsible for everything and should be responsible for everything. And America is a power, and America does colonial things. And a lot of the things that, for example, Professor Chomsky says about America and Guatemala are certainly true, but it doesn't follow from that America is always responsible for everything and that no one else has any agency around the world. And I think the idea that no one has any agency except America is comfortable for a certain part of the American left. And then there's also just this basic problem that no one knows anything about Ukrainian history, which some of us have been working very hard on trying to solve these last few years. But if nobody knows anything about history, what history does is that it gets in the way of simple narratives like Ukraine has never existed, or Ukrainian culture has always been part of Russian culture. Those are simple narratives and they're appealing because of their simplicity. History gets in the way of that. And so you always need more, we need much more history than we actually have.
Oh, once again, thank you very much. And I must admit that since the war erupted, I repeat rather, let's say, to everyone who cares to listen to, that one positive thing coming out of this war is that it might kill the notion of post-Soviet studies, when people just take Russian language skills and the Russian mold, and they think that they can explain, by the example of Russia, everything which happens in Ukraine and in Kyrgyzstan and in Kazakhstan. Because actually 30 years has passed, and we have taken very different trajectories. So you actually have to go to the sources, to the context, and you cannot understand the Ukrainian context without Ukrainian language or Kazakh context without Kazakh language. So yeah, I do agree. People who don't come here, who haven't mastered the language, they're actually alienated from the issues on the ground, I think.
But there's also, there's just a general point there about decentering history, which is not just about Russia. And this goes back to your point about, the question about the left. In general, I agree with people on the left who say that American history has to be treated critically. We have to bring in the voices that have been ignored. We have to listen to the things that make us uncomfortable, right? So in America right now, there's a big debate about whether children should have to listen to history, which is not comfortable. And I think they have to. History is always uncomfortable. But if you take that view about America, you also have to take that view about China. And you also have to take that view about Russia. If history is about uncomfortable things, then you can't approve Russian memory laws. Then you can't approve Russian taboos about Holodomor. If empire is to be questioned and decentered, then you have to do that everywhere. It has to be a general methodological practice. You can't just say, well, we're going to do it in one country, but in other countries, imperial discourse is just fine, right? That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah, exactly. And there is a kind of maybe myopy of hypocrisy. It is a matter of debate, which precisely. But when you have a chronic capitalist regime and the leftists actually accept it, and everything it does to enrich only a fracture of society, making others people poor. So it's quite bizarre, and I think there will be kind of soul searching among the left circles as well, whichever way this finishes. The war.
I think look, I'll make a very optimistic point or a very hopeful point. I think it's the chance for the revival of the left, because the idea that you can be the left just by identifying with the people who criticize America doesn't work at all. Because who criticizes America? Beijing and Moscow. Those are the most powerful critics of America. And you just can't be on the left by identifying yourself with those kinds of regimes. As you say, you have to be on the left by identifying with certain kinds of principles. You've implied one principle, which is equality, right? So so identify with equality, that's great. And then that becomes a way of criticizing Beijing and Moscow, and also to a lesser extent, America. But certainly, my way of thinking about this has always been to say that Russia is not it's not an alternative to the United States. It's more like a cracked mirror. It's more like a place where the United States can go. If we allow our own oligarchy to proceed to an extreme, then we end up in a place like Russia. So let's use Russia as a check, right, on the way we shouldn't be, as to imagining that Russia is some kind of alternative or a source of criticism, because that is clearly not.
Yeah, I do agree. Let's continue with history and the kind of psychoanalysis. I'll explain what I'm meaning. So Stalin, he was offended by the miracle on the Vistula. And once again, you can disagree or agree, just give me a hint whether you are on the same page in this respect that I am. But I think that being offended by the miracle on the Vistula and the huge debacle the Soviet army, the Red Army, got by the Polish people, so he harbored some resentments toward the Polish nation, and it was at least partially responsible for his murderous attitude toward the Poles, which you actually described in several of your books. Putin, he was offended by the Orange Revolution. So is this what that's all about? A dictator and his personal trauma? Is this a part of the hatred we see in Putin's eyes toward Ukraine, or there is something more?
Well, I first of all, I think your point should be read as a kind of analytical point about tyranny. So whether or not we think of psychoanalysis or not, it's clearly a problem when an individual's prejudices or traumatic experiences with respect to another collectivity become the basis of policy, right? That's just a problem, whether it's about Poles or Ukrainians or whatever. That's clearly a problem. And it is a problem that we see in kind of spectacularly clear form with Putin right now. This is what, when you have an aging, obsessive dictator who is increasingly unchecked by other institutions, you're going to get something like this, right? Because it's harder and harder for the tyrant to distinguish his own traumas and obsessions from the interests of his country. And at this point, Putin is not making that distinction at all. Just where it comes from, though, actually pretending to be the psychoanalyst, I think is harder. But I think that there are a lot of things that are going on here. Part of it, there's the inheritance of the Soviet Union, in which Russia is the victor in the Second World War, and the Ukrainians are in an ambiguous position, and you're allowed to call them fascists when that's convenient. For example, under Zhdanov. There are the Brezhnev years when Putin was young, where the idea was that there's going to be this, Sliania, that there might be variety in the Soviet Union, but really only Russian counts. We only really need a Russian intelligentsia. That's what really matters, and that's normal. And then I think there is, maybe more importantly, there's the failure of Putin's initial project, which was to try to create a Russia which was in some way a rule of law state. That's what he says he's going to do, but he ends up along the way becoming the head of the only oligarchical clan that matters, right? Mm-hmm. So instead of getting rid of oligarchy, he centralizes oligarchy and makes oligarchy the central proposition, the central principle of his own rule. And once you've done that, then domestic reform becomes impossible, and the only realm of state action is outside, whether that is Ukraine, whether that's Georgia, or whether that's Ukraine, or whether that's Syria. I found it very striking that the last time around, after the last Russian invasion of Ukraine, when that reached its limits, they immediately switched to Syria. There was a weekend in the end of September 2015 where the entire Russian press just switched from Ukraine to Syria, right? And what's missing is an idea of Russian policy or what Russia is going to be in the future. So once you freeze Russia into an oligarchy, then the action has to be somehow outside, right? And also the action can't be in the future. It has to somehow be in the past. It has to be about, the baptism of, Volodymyr, or it has to be about the Second World War. It has to be about some kind of myth, some kind of moment when everything was fine in the past. And the reason why you have to do it that way is you can't talk about the future, because once the state becomes an oligarchy, there is no future. You can't change anything with the state at that point, right? You have to operate inside the past. So there are many sources of this. And I don't think all of them are just in the last few years. I think some of them go back much further.
Okay, thank you. I have several more questions, but I also cannot usurp the microphone, so I'll also voice out the questions by the public. But two questions I think are for me are important to be asked. So the first one is about the COVID. You yourself had a personal, rather drastic experience with this disease. And how do you think, could COVID be responsible for the deterioration of Putin's policy? He used to be a master of policy making, yes, and of public presentations. And today he's like a broken man who everything he touches becomes not gold, but I don't want to use S words here. I don't want to swear. So he's like a counterpart of what he used to be. Is it because of COVID? Could it be that the reason of COVID?
Well, so I think COVID is connected to this war in a couple of ways. But first of all, the very fact that we're asking this question, to repeat a point I made earlier, shows how we're in the classic realm of tyranny. Like tyranny as described by, Plato, tyranny as described by Shakespeare, where it's all about is he sick, right? That's a question that only matters when you're in this realm of personal rule, right? And so, whether or not I have a satisfactory answer for you, like I agree with the premise, which is that we have to talk about things like that because of the nature of the Russian political system, right? So what I can tell from a distance is that COVID isolation is a bad thing psychically for everyone. And it does seem that Mr. Putin was especially concerned, let's say, about the possibility that he would become sick. And so those 2 years where he was even more isolated from contact with other people than he would have been, I tend to think probably accelerated a process which was going on anyway, of his moving away from the tactics that he was once so good at, right? The kind of the Poles have a nice word, sociotechnika, which also exists, I know, in other languages. That the social technology that he was once so good at, and towards this world of ideology in which he alone is the savior of his country. I think it accelerated that process. I think it also, the fact that COVID meant that there was just less interaction among countries, I think that probably also accelerated this war. It made everything seem abstract. And then just as just to kind of a footnote to all this, I think one of the reasons why people looked at Zelensky in the first few days of the war and said, okay, this is something we're very happy to see, is that suddenly, like, this was a country and a man who were taking control of their own situation. To turn this around, I think the world has been also frozen by COVID. And the fact that people looked and said, okay, here's someone who is taking initiative at this time when we've all, in a way, been constrained. Like, I think people found something healthy in this horrible situation. I'm not trying to make it good. But in this horrible situation, I think, in a way, the fact that we were all shut down by COVID meant that people were ready for a Zelensky or ready for a Ukraine to say, look, there's something more important and immediate happening right now. And human beings can actually rise up and react to it in a flexible, creative way. I think that's one of the reasons why Ukraine has been heartening for a lot of people, is that.
Yeah, thank you. I would only add that in addition to Plato and Shakespeare, that reading of the tyrannical system, it also coincides with the Bruce Banner de Mesquita's explanation that in dictatorships, a sick dictator is the problem of the whole system. And when he is dying, you might see really drastic changes. So yeah, it is about the system, not about the one person we are talking about actually now.
Absolutely, yeah.
And my last question, and then we'll try to pick up the best questions from the public, is about one of the first book of yours. In the Reconstruction of Nations, Poland, Ukraine, Lithuania, and Belarus, you actually tried to show to the Western public a forgotten country, the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. And you depicted it, and I think correctly, as a multi-ethnic, multilingual confederation that managed to keep a diverse territory almost in peace for roughly 2 centuries. And today, Poland and Lithuania are amongst the most ardent supporters of Ukraine. So is this a sign of the Commonwealth being resurrected?
Well, so the Commonwealth isn't going to be resurrected, because the Commonwealth was based upon the idea that about 10% of the population should be allowed to own land and vote. Which,
yeah, I do agree. It was medieval.
Which at the time was quite, at the time that was actually quite progressive, especially the voting part. But so, I would think about it in a, not so much in a kind of revival sense. I know you didn't mean that literally, but more in the sense of, I would think about it more, as I also think about the Habsburg monarchy, as a question about what the 21st century is actually like. So is the 21st century about empires breaking up into small homogeneous units, which have very simple languages and tell very simple stories? Or is the 21st century about units which, although they're post-imperial, are not homogeneous, that work creatively with some of the imperial inheritances right? So in this sense, I mean, what I'm saying is that maybe Ukraine is a bit more normal than one might have thought. And that, like, when we think of the Commonwealth or the Habsburg monarchy as European entities, which were actually very durable, more durable than nation states, that can help us to see, just in a very rough way, that something like Ukraine is possible, right? So a place where it's not the center that matters, right? The decentralization is very important, that there can be multiple religions and even multiple languages, and the place can not only function, but maybe in some ways function better than homogeneous unit. So I'm taking your question in a different direction. When it comes to Poland and Lithuania, I would say that that's more about, like, what I think it was a Czech philosopher, Jan Patočka, I think, is the one who said this, but the solidarity of the shaken, where there's a recognition of similarity, right? So especially like in the Polish welcome of Ukrainian refugees, which, if you just look narrowly at the history of Polish-Ukrainian relations, it's not at all obvious that something like that would happen. But if you look at it more broadly as Poles recognizing something happening to someone else, which is similar to something that happened to them, then it becomes more explicable. And I think that is, in fact, what's happening, right? So it's not exactly the Commonwealth, but it's more of a 20th century phenomenon where Poles are able to say, yeah, we understand, we get that, we see where you're coming from. And the same with Lithuania, that, like, it's a recognition, of a certain kind of pattern.
Okay, thank you. And I have to admit, you got it right. It was not a literal question about the resurrection of Commonwealth. It was like a metaphor. So thank you for answering my questions. And now we have like 6 minutes. We promised to have a 1 hour net, 60 minutes net. So I will follow our agreement. There is a very interesting question by Roman Stiblivsky, which actually shows that the gentleman read text of yours. So he wonders whether it is possible that the eternity politics in Russia would be changed. And if yes, if positive, under what circumstances?
So when we look at the whole broad sweep of European history, European countries have to lose imperial wars. That's what has to happen. I mean, for France to be France as it is today, it had to lose in Algeria and in Vietnam. For Germany to be Germany, it had to lose on the Eastern Front. For the Netherlands to be the Netherlands, it had to lose in Indonesia. For Portugal and Spain to be Portugal and Spain, they had to lose in Africa. This is the way it goes. And I'm not saying that losing in war is always going to be a sufficient condition for transformation, but I think it's a necessary condition. I think the only way for Russia to have a serious conversation about Russia is for Russia to lose this war. So that's my short answer. That imperialism allows the past to be recycled, and that's what Putin is doing. And the past, notions of past greatness as a substitute for present policy only break when you're confronted with a very basic kind of reality, which is that we can't really be an imperial power because we just lost a war against against what we thought was going to be an easy opponent. So I would like to, I don't think that Russia escapes from this general pattern. I think that Russia has to lose this war for there to be a discussion in Russia about what Russia actually is. And it's not going to be easy or simple, but I think that's my basic answer. The politics of eternity can only change when the political discussion ceases to be about becoming ourselves by destroying other people.
Okay, thank you. I hope Roman Stiblivsky is satisfied with the answer. I myself am. There is another very interesting question, and it brings us back to the Erinnerungspolitik in Germany. So a gentleman wonders whether the recent debate in Germany about whether it is useful and even permissible to supply Ukraine with arms, whether it has something to do with the German memory politics in Germany. So how do you think, and in particular, there was a scandalous, at least in Ukraine, article by Jürgen Habermas, where he refers to Ukraine in not so good terms. So let's start with the weapon question. Whether the politics of Russia toward the Germany toward the weapon supply to Ukraine has something to do, and what does it have to do with the Erinnerungspolitik, memory policy?
Yeah, I mean, it has everything to do with the Erinnerungspolitik. So first of all, to be fair, I think the Germans are absolutely right that democracy depends upon a constant re-engagement with history. I think they're right about that. And when we say Russia has to engage its own past and so on, we should recognize that the country in Europe which says that you should engage with its past is Germany. Now, does that mean that Germans are always correctly engaging with their own past? No, because part of engaging with your own past is recognizing that your prior interpretations were not necessarily correct. And so in the German case, much of Erinnerungspolitik has been based upon has been connected to Ostpolitik, returning to your earlier question. So sometimes the Erinnerungspolitik has gone in the direction of what's comfortable as Ostpolitik. In other words, if we're going to express our guilt for the Second World War, let's do so with respect to Moscow. And in order to have an honest Erinnerungspolitik, history has to be included. And what history says is that the German war on the Eastern Front was largely about Ukraine, largely fought in Ukraine. Ukraine was supposed to be the main German colony. And so what the Germans didn't do is they never directed an Erinnerungspolitik towards Ukraine. That never happened. It didn't happen during the Cold War, obviously, but it also hasn't happened in the 30 years since 1991. And so the Germans now are still, in a way, recovering from their own colonial attitude towards Ukraine, which was reinforced by colonial attitudes towards Ukraine coming from Russia. There's been they're not the same thing, but there's been a kind of overlap of a German tradition of not seeing Ukraine as a subject with a Russian tradition of not seeing Ukraine as a subject. And so now the Germans in the last few weeks have been trying to recover from the absence of this conversation. But the reason for hope is that you can always appeal to the principle that you have to think of the past, and you can make the argument to the Germans that, look, this was a colonial war and you have never come to terms with it, and now is the time to come to terms with it. It's of course, so the debate is about what it means to take historical responsibility. And I think, if you're Ukrainian or if you're interested in Germany, you have to engage in the debate at that level, because only at that level can you actually win the argument, because those are the parameters, those are the rules. The people who say, let's just listen to Russia or Ukraine should surrender, I mean, their notion of historical responsibility, in my view, is narrow and misunderstands what actually happens in the war. So, I mean, if you think that Germany shouldn't help Ukraine because that just extends the war, then you would also say logically, America shouldn't have helped Britain because that just extended the Second World War, right? On that principle, the aggressor is always right. And that, for me, that's not the right lesson from the Second World War. There has to be a more sophisticated lesson. And I'm telling Ukrainians this instead of Germans, so you already know this, but the first step of coming to terms with the past is listening to the other side. And there I'm very sympathetic with Ukrainians, because the Germans have had a very hard time listening to Ukrainians. And there's been a lot of irritation and a lot of just rudeness of Germans towards Ukrainians. And that's a sign of a failure. Like, you don't accept the other side as an equal partner in discussion. You just find them irritating. You want them to go away. You want everything to be simple.
Yeah. Well, I think we have run out of your time. So thank you for an inspiring talk. Actually, this was like a real event for global minds for Ukraine. Timothy Snyder, professor of Yale University, was here talking with us. Thank you for sharing your expertise. And it is no more morning in America. It is a day. So have a good day. Thank you for your time, Professor Snyder.
Вам також дуже дякую за зустріч.
Це було дуже і дуже цікаво. Гарного вам дня. До побачення.
До побачення.